I'm going to be the moderator of this workshop, and our workshop has the theme Education Policy and Development Cooperation. It's an hybrid workshop, so we are going to have audience online and those who are here, of course. And for those who are not aware about the Finnish Society for Development Research, maybe before we start, I could just give a brief explanation about it. Basically, this is the multidisciplinary scientific society that provide the platform and opportunities for researchers and students and practitioners who are interested in development studies on development issues, especially for those who are coming from the Global South. So as the part of the very good society in here in Finland, we have decided to come up with this workshop, of which, of course, we're going to focus on education policy and development cooperation. It, of course, aligns well with the SDG-4, which is on equality education. As I introduce myself, I'm Judith, but also I'm the member of the Finnish Society for Development Research. So, I would like now to introduce the speakers. We are going to have 3 speakers today. The first one is, I need to move 3 seconds. The first one is Minna Hakkarainen, who is coming from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. She works the head of the cooperation at the Embassy of Finland in Kiev. Her topic is on why coordination matters in the field of education support and why it's so difficult. So she's going to give us some experience from the case of Ukraine. And the second is Bonn Juego, who is a senior lecturer here at the University of Jyväskylä, and she is also the chairperson of the Finnish Society for Development Research. He's going to give you a topic on about from the global education reform movement to the human capital development agenda, educating for proletarianization. And the last presenter may not be in the way of presenting, but the one I'm going to introduce as the last one is Marinka Räsänen. She's a doctoral researcher from the University of Helsinki, and our presentation will be on education in terms of multiple crises, pathways towards gender justice, democracy, and socio-environmental transformation learning. So these are going to be our 3 presenters. I'd not give like the full bio of themselves, so the time they'll be presenting, they may wish to introduce themselves further so that you can get to know them better. But the very important thing is about time management. So as they're going to present, each presenter will be given 15 minutes. So if they find that time is going to be enough for them and also introduce themselves further, that would be amazing. I think people that wish to know who is presenting and how that connects with what she's presenting or is presenting. So just before we start giving just a little bit of the agenda, of course, you're going to have the presenters presenting. All of them are going to present. And then after that, we are going to have more or less of a discussion. We are going to have also question and answers all together. I know this is a very short session. We cannot say that you're going to have just a typical panel discussion and also engage the audience. So I think it will be very important after they've presented, and then we're going to have the very interactive discussion and questions as well. Yes. So to start with, I would like to invite Marinka Räsänen. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marinka Räsänen, and I will open my... Where's the presentation? Oh, yeah, it's here. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay, good. All right, let's go on. Okay. So today I will be talking about education in times of multiple crises, pathways toward gender justice, democracy, and socio-environmentally transformative learning. This is also a title of a research project that has just recently started, actually this year, and I'm presenting our research project rationale and the aims, and also a little bit background research that my team members have come. Actually, our project leader, Tuija Veintie, was supposed to come here today, but I am presenting on her behalf. But I will share with you some interesting things. This picture is from the Ecuadorian Amazon, and where my team members have been conducting research before. So before I go further, let me just introduce our project a little bit and the project members. So first of all, Tuija Veintie is our project leader. She's from the University of Helsinki, from the Institute of Sustainability Science, HELSUS. And she's also the Work Package 2 leader. And she has done research in indigenous knowledge and local ecocultural knowledge and intercultural bilingual education in the Ecuadorian Amazon. So the photo was taken by her. And then we have Rose Inguita. She's a PhD in agricultural economics. She has expertise in rural livelihoods, in women marginalization in education, and also child poverty. And she's at the University of Helsinki also, and working with us now since early this year. Johanna Hohenthal, she's a PhD in geography, and she's done research in local ecological knowledge and water management in Taita Hills, Kenya. And now she's at the University of Helsinki and also at LUT University. Then we have Natalie Pinto. She's currently finishing her PhD at Aalto University, and she's working on conducting her doctoral research on participatory design, where she's co-designing a system of pictograms and infographics for popular education processes with and for indigenous young people in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Yeah, so that's my team. And the project was funded by CONEF Foundation, and since the beginning of this year and until the 2028. So it's one example of what you all could be doing at one time. And myself, I'm actually an alumni of DNIC, now DEICO. From 2015, I graduated from this university. It's my home university. And since then, I've been a mother for 2 years. And also I came back here to study more education, adult education, and I've been teaching 3 years in integration training, immigrants and refugees in adult education. And now I just started my PhD in this project. And I'm enrolled in the SEDUCE program in education in University of Helsinki. So yes, that is my background, and you can ask more questions then later if you want to know the pathway. Maybe a lot of you are also interested in PhD studies, so I recommend. But yes, let's continue now with the project. How do I change this? How come? It's not changing. Oh, sorry. Okay, so let me begin by giving some background to why this project was created, or what was sort of the background idea. This is a case from the Ecuadorian Amazon where some of our colleagues have been doing work. Tuija Veintie was leading the project there. And this is and the picture is from an indigenous Quechua community of Sarayaca along the river Bobonaza in Pastaza province in Ecuador, in the middle of the Amazon. And this is really a showcase of also the title, Education in Times of Multiple Crises. So what happens when different crises intertwine together? What kind of effects can come up? So in 2020, the COVID-19 outbreak took place at the same time with extreme floods that destroyed bridges, schools, houses, crops, and belongings of many families in the indigenous Quechua community of Sarayaku, and also other communities along the river Bobonaza. During this time, the community did not receive much help from the state. People in the community managed because of community resilience, indigenous expertise on how to live in the rainforest. Also reciprocity, sharing between families, and collaboration within the community to overcome the adversities related to the flood and the pandemic. In Ecuador, as in most countries, schools were ordered to function in distance education modality. You know, you can imagine in the Amazon, this was not possible. The people do not have internet. They also, or they were very limited connection. Most of the students and teachers did not have computers or mobile phones. Still from the state, this was what they were supposed to do. And at first, people in the community saw the positive side of this interruption to schooling during the pandemic. And they claimed that it provided a good opportunity to intensify family relations and also for intergenerational learning. So in many communities, people learned from the elders, and they saw this as a positive thing at first. And they were also together rebuilding the infrastructures and the things that had been damaged by the flood. Then later, the community members started to also worry about the interruption to schooling and the learning gaps that the young people and the children were starting to have. And also the stress, like the students and the young people started to feel like they're falling behind now. You know, everyone else is learning online, but we are not able to keep up with the formal school system. So even though they were not supposed to come to face learning, this community exercised their self-determination, and they decided to adopt face-to-face classes, contrary to the order given at national level. So a kind of community resistance as well. So this is one case that is really central to our study, and we build on this one later. Now I'll just give a few examples also what happened in Kenya, another context where we are carrying out this research. In Kenya, during COVID-19, there were many shocks as well to the education system, and especially marginalized households who rely on informal employment, like, for example, just vending things. And the lockdown really influenced a lot of this different informal employment. And as you can imagine, many of them could not pay for the school. As we heard this morning, a lot of schools in the global south you have to pay for them. So they could not have money to bring them to school. So this was one thing, to have like school materials and things. Of course, the school was then also taken to the same as in Ecuador, so to have just the online systems. But also this was a problem in the rural Kenya, as only 23% of students had access to a tablet or computer at home, and only 5% had internet connectivity. So we can see this exacerbated education disparities because students from the poor and vulnerable and marginalized households did not have access to these tools of learning. Now we're also conducting research in the Finnish context, so just a little bit background. Of course, in Finland, the impacts of COVID were different. And if we talk about multiple crises, also the impacts of crises are different here in Finland. So, but there were some studies have been done, and I think many are ongoing about the impacts of COVID. And in Finland, especially young women who are about to transition to adulthood or from education to working life, and youth with immigrant background were particularly affected by diminished employment opportunities in the service sector. Also in Finland, maybe you have heard, or maybe even yourself have been feeling that the ongoing climate emergency, which is like a looming crisis, it's not as floods and as things like that, but it's like an awareness that things are not going as they should be. This is raising difficult feelings of anxiety, worry, sadness, and fear among young people, this generation. But it's also, of course, creating this critical thinking and for social action. So this is really like a background for what we want to do in our project. We can see that during the pandemic, people's lives in various parts of the world were affected by these multiple crises, and they continue to be. And they also have intersectional impacts, or we call them gendered social inequalities. So how social inequalities are exasperating the impacts of crisis. This is something that can be seen throughout the crisis situations. But more research is needed on these gendered social inequalities as well that are exasperated by crisis. So in our project, we aim to understand how climate change and other concurrent socio-environmental crises and inequities affect particularly girls and young women's education and the forms of resilience they portray. So not only how they are affected, but also how the resilience is formed. As we saw in the Ecuadorian case, people are not only victims, but also have resilience embedded in the culture. And this can be a source of strength in times of crisis. And the project also aims to support marginalized young people, particularly girls and women's educational trajectories, well-being, participation in society, through co-developing educational approaches that can also support resilience. And what do we mean by resilience? Our research aligns with earlier studies that call upon this intersectional approach to resilience, which means the different social identities or categories, gender, ethnicity, others that intersect together. And we can see how in the face of multiple crises, then these there are different ways that people can form a resilience together and also individually. And we also perceive resilience as the capacity of both the individual and community to contribute to socio-ecological transformation. So how can a crisis become also a source of transformation and a sort of a time to think what could be done differently? I think the COVID pandemic raised a lot of questions in many people's minds, and and showed forth many forms of communal resilience. So in the project, we focus on these three countries that I was talking about: Ecuador, Kenya, and Finland. How much time? I've lost track. 2 minutes, okay. So just briefly, some of the questions that we are asking in specific terms. We are asking, what are the consequences of multiple crises to gendered social inequalities in school attendance and educational attainment? Which social, economic, environmental factors contribute positively to students' performance and school completion during crisis? And this is the work that has been ongoing now for a few months. An online survey is being conducted in lower and upper secondary schools in Finland. A total of 285 students have responded to the survey so far. And we're aiming to also conduct a similar survey in Kenya and in Ecuador. So we have this kind of multi-method approach in this project. I don't have so much time to tell so much about the methods, but just to briefly. So the first work package is working on this survey data. Then in the second work package, it's mostly about interviews and more qualitative participatory research. We are interested in the collective resilience to adversity and the resistance to inequalities among indigenous and minoritized young people. So this is some of the groups of people that Tuija and others have been working with. And also how young people experience and deal with adversities and worries related to climate change and other ongoing emergencies. So really to talk with the people and see how do they experience these emergencies. And as well, we're interested in the gendered vulnerabilities and collectively built capacities to respond to current and future hazards. Then in the last work package, we want to develop together with some people that want to work with us, educational approaches for equity, socio-ecological transformation, and resilience. Maybe you have heard of transformative learning. So this is something this is part of my PhD actually. So I want to ask what kind of place-based and eco-culturally oriented educational approaches and contents and methods could mitigate girls and young women's learning losses in crisis situations and serve eco-social transformation and collective resilience. Lots of words, but basically what could we do together and co-create with the people that we are engaged with that could somehow could bring about more resilience in the collective. So I want to organize these kinds of workshops together with students and teachers in upper secondary schools, both in Finland and also in Kenya. And the use of local forms of art, for example, spoken word, written, creative writing, movement, music, visual, as much as possible. This is my idea, to use these kinds of art workshops so that the resilience that can be that is embedded in the culture could maybe come up already when we're using different forms than just reading and writing and this. So this is the idea. Yeah, I think I'm out of time. Thank you very much, everyone. References and yeah. Did I go much over time?
No, just 1 minute.
Okay.
Thank you so much for a very nice presentation about the project.
Yeah.
I think it's quite interesting, and I cannot wait to hear from the audience. Wow, so the second presenter is Minna. You're welcome.
Do I have to share this separately?
Let me help. Here. And so just a quick communication with those who are online. If you have any question, you can now start writing in the chat corner so that it can be easy to follow up after the presentations are done.
Thank you. Maybe a little bit before I start about my own background and my interests. First of all, I must say that I'm very happy to be here. I used to be also the chair of Finnish Society for Development Research, and I did my PhD to development studies nearly 10 years ago. But I'm also a qualified teacher, and I've been working extensively in schools and with teachers and with principals and educators more broadly. And nearly past 5 years, I've been living in Ukraine, in Kiev, and working in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, the Embassy of Finland in Kiev. And I've been working as an education counsellor mainly, but also acting as a head of cooperation. So my presentation today is not going to be very scientific, but rather I would like to sort of open a little bit of avenue of what you can do with the skills that you can get from the academia, also in the working life, in the real work, so to speak. So outside of the university, which has always been something that has interested me. So before I start, how many of you have been to Ukraine? 0. How many of you know where Ukraine is? Everybody, right? Pretty much. And why do we know? I would claim we know about Ukraine because of the war. Similarly, I would claim as that we knew about Vietnam decades ago because of the war. Unfortunately, some countries become well known because of the tragedies. Okay, so where do I... Here. Okay, so coordination, aid coordination in general, and here I'm talking about education, like coordination in the education sector. So first of all, if we take the context of Ukraine, key stakeholders, the EU, G7, the donor countries, some of them are part of the G7, but also countries outside of the G7 and outside also of the EU. International financial institutions. In the keynote speech, we heard about World Bank, IMF, not necessarily in a very, very positive mode, but my experience is that even World Bank is not one World Bank, but it can work differently in different parts of the world. In Ukraine, World Bank is coming heavily on education support. We are talking about hundreds of millions of US dollars. We are talking about World Bank support to Ukraine's education sector based on the needs identified by the Ukrainian government and the Ministry of Education and Science. So it is not about World Bank coming to Ukraine and saying this is what you need to do. It is World Bank asking, what is it that you need us to do? And basically World Bank doesn't do these things themselves. They give money, others implement, but they monitor the outcomes. So the money flows only if there are results. So I think that for me, it's very important to understand that any development theory that you learn can be criticized. Every single development theory has its limits and limitations. There is no one solution, whether capitalism or non-capitalism. We have to understand the context. Contexts are different, cultures are different, and so are the outcomes of whatever development theory we will do. UN organizations and CSOs. So I just wanted you to understand that it's a huge amount of very different, diverse actors that are all engaged in education sector. And they all have their different logics, etc. And this already makes things interesting. In Ukrainian context, there are two types of aid coordination in the field of education. The first one was set up in 2020, just actually before the COVID. It is so-called three-tier aid coordination structure. And I'm going to talk to you mainly about sectoral working groups, which is the lowest level of this one, which is about international technical assistance coordination. But since 2022, the education cluster very heavily also came into Ukraine and started to coordinate education in emergency, that is the humanitarian aid to education field. So what is a sector working group? Sector working group, I mean, there were 28 sector working groups established in collaboration with the Ukrainian government and the donor community. And education sector working group on education and science is one of those 28 sector working groups. It is chaired by the first Deputy Minister of Education and co-chaired by Finland and UNICEF. So I have been co-chairing the sector working group on education and science in Ukraine since the very beginning of establishment of this structure, together with the Ministry of Education and Science and also colleagues from the UNICEF. So what this sector working group is expected to do, for instance, ensure policy alignment, monitor the implementation, set strategic direction, etc. These are all something which are in the terms of references of the sector working groups, which was developed by the government of Ukraine. Very much on paper, not so much on practice though. And why? In the previous presentation, you already heard about pandemic. We all know about pandemic, and that hit also Ukraine in early 2020. So very soon after the sector working groups were established, came the global pandemic and very much changed. So before that, the focus on education policy had been on comprehensive education reform, so-called new Ukrainian school reform. But due to the pandemic, the discourse changed into access to education. It was no longer about the content of education and how to develop that, but rather how the children and young people actually can access education when you cannot go to the schools. So the key question then became how to transfer education from offline to online mode to ensure continuation of education process. And this is, of course, something that I would say that most countries experienced one way or another. So the whole discourse changed into internet connectivity, devices, all Ukrainian online education platform that the government started to develop very quickly. And therefore, instead of looking on more long-term developmental education issues, the sector working group also turned into something which was used by the government of Ukraine to try to convey the messages to the development partners. What do we need? How can you support us? Here I would like to say that Ukraine is very different from so-called traditional aid recipient countries, even though, in fact, it is lower middle income country, just like, for instance, Vietnam, that my research previously have touched upon. And having talked to my Finnish colleagues, even researchers or development practitioners, they keep asking, so why do we support Ukraine? And when I say that, well, why did we support Vietnam, for instance? Or why OECD DAC allows us to support lower middle income countries? They are like, what? Is Ukraine lower middle income country? So we know actually very little. Even in the fields of development practitioners, we know very little about the country. Also, I mean, we heard this morning about colonizing. Ukrainian Minister of Education constantly talks about decolonizing. But they have been colonized by the Soviet Union. They have not been colonized by capitalists from the north, but by their neighbor Russia. And this is an ongoing process. So my message to you is that even though sometimes it may feel like development scholars are not sort of considering Ukraine as something of worth our attention, it actually is, because it breaks so many general assumptions of those who are being aided and those who are not. Then the war. Everybody has heard about the war. I know that globally, different countries where you also come from, your governments may have very different views on this war. But I'm talking about how it impacted to the education sector. So once the war broke, February 22, I was evacuated from Kiev 4 days before, because by that time we got a lot of intelligence information to the ministry, knowing that Russia is in fact actually going to attack Ukraine. It was very hard to believe that some country would do something so stupid. But then the sector working group was used by the government of Ukraine to inform the development partners about the damage done to education institutions. Schools were hit and continue to be hit by missiles. Thousands of schools have been destroyed fully or partially. So it became a problem of not actually having the school building even. And then also what support was needed to enable education process to continue. So first, the discussion was, okay, it was actually good that we had COVID because now we have online education. The country was prepared and was rather successful in implementing online education. But the first winter of the war, late 22, early 23, actually showed that this is no longer the case, and why it was not. Because there was no electricity. Russia was bombing electricity stations all the time in different parts of the country. And think of online education with no electricity, no connectivity, and so forth. But then the question was, okay, online education no longer works. It's not a solution in the wartime. So what is the alternative? Taking children back to schools. But thousands of schools, hundreds of schools are continuously being targeted by Russia. So now the discourse is about we need to get shelters so that when there is attack, when there are missiles, when there are drones, the teachers can take children to the shelters. But there is a huge need for reconstructing or constructing shelters in schools. There is a question again about electricity and heating. Ukraine's climate is actually rather similar to Finnish climate. So summers are hotter and longer, but winters can be very cold. So if the school doesn't have heating, you cannot take children to school, even if there is a shelter. And then school buses, because many local schools have been destroyed or do not have the shelter. You have to take children somewhere to learn. If you don't have these buses, so a lot of children remain out of the education, out of access to education. But many school buses, most of the school buses in fact, have been taken by the military of Ukraine because they desperately needed vehicles for the military purposes to defend the country. Teachers, over 20,000 teachers, Ukrainian teachers, actually have left the country when the war broke. Many of them still have some kind of the contact, online contact to their students, but not all. Children's locations. Millions of Ukrainian children have been relocated due to this war. Many of them are residing in different countries in Europe or USA or UK, Finland included. But many are also residing as internally displaced children in different parts of Ukraine, mainly from the east to the west. So this is something that we actually, in the latest head of cooperation meeting in Kiev, we had the discussion so that we as a community of donors, we have to understand that in order to get children back to school, all of these have to be taken care at the same time. If you have heating and shelter, but you don't have school buses, children still cannot go to school. If you have all of these, but you don't have teachers, well, children cannot go to school. And this is one of the challenges. In the morning, we heard that development studies is interdisciplinary field, but so are the real life problems. You have to think about many different things at the same time. You have to operationalize them at the same time. If we fail in that, children will lose. And then also, for making informed decisions, we do need information, accurate data. We have to know where the children actually are, how many they are, etc., etc. All of this is lacking. It's very difficult to get any reliable data in the state of the war, as we understand. And that also hampers effective planning. So it's very much about like multiple questions at the same time that have to be taken into consideration. So I've listed here some examples of coordination challenges. For instance, if we think about sector working group, so who should actually be invited to the sector working group meetings? And this is actually one of the discussions that we've had for several years. Donor countries, international financial institutions, UN agencies, civil society organizations. Who? All of them? Just selectively some of them? On what grounds? And that, of course, relates to the terms of reference of the group itself. But then, for instance, something very practical. What we have realized that when there is a time of urgency and need, the government of Ukraine is turning to every single potential donor or development partner, as they want to say, to ask for similar help. And they don't necessarily tell the others that actually we have talked to Finland, or we have talked to the World Bank, we have talked to the OECD, or we have talked to Germany to get this support. So in reality, we very much also struggle with information flow in this sense, that we don't start doing similar things. Why this is acute is because Finland was asked to support upper secondary school reform. And we had been planning that already for a year or so, when we learned that actually World Bank is planning the same thing, because the government had asked the same thing from the World Bank. So now we have been negotiating heavily with the World Bank to sort of make sure that we don't give overlapping support, that we will use the resources as efficiently as possible. Then about monitoring. What do you actually monitor if there is no costed sector plan, if there are no indicators against which you can actually see if the results have been reached or not? If there is no political readiness to develop the needed monitoring tool. We have been discussing this with the UNICEF many times, and then we came up with a conclusion that UNICEF will pay UNESCO's International Institute of Educational Planning to develop a monitoring tool for the sector working group. It went well until it stopped, and it was stopped because for some reason, I can't go unfortunately to the details of that, the government of Ukraine, the Ministry of Education stopped that. So we started, but then we could not move forward on that one. So that means that there are still no clear indicators, no real targets against which the sector working group can actually monitor things. Then there's also long-term versus short-term needs. Because of COVID and because of the war, we are very much focused on short-term. And my time is so over. This is the last slide. What we have seen in Ukraine is actually not what we have seen in many other conflicts. We have seen skyrocketing aid to Ukraine by different development partners and donors. But that also makes it even more important to try to coordinate. Because that kind of influx of actors that I have witnessed in Ukraine, I think that's very seldom you can see anywhere, also in the education sector, which is also not normal situation. In many crises, education is not really attracting a lot of support. So I will not go into the details of that. I just say that now there has been a political process which has taken a year, in which the number of sector working groups has been decreased into 18. The G7 and EU were basically proposing decreasing them into 10, but that did not work out. But this is the last, as I said. What I would like to say, something which is out of this, and which somehow touches upon the whole aid system. Humanitarian actors have been surprised when they landed Ukraine. Actors who have been very experienced in being in different parts of the world in humanitarian context. Why? Because Ukraine does not behave as a traditional development cooperation aid recipient country. Over and over again, organizations, international organizations came to me and asked, Minna, please explain this education system here, explain this society. And I realized that they have used to work among themselves. They go to some place, they do their thing, and that's it. In Ukraine, you cannot do that because they have government. They have a strong government. They have ministries, line ministries, which say, this is what we need. This is what we want you to do. And I think that there would be a lot to learn from Ukraine, from other countries which get international support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minna, for a very nice presentation. And now we are going to hear our last presenter, Dr. Bonn Juego.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Bonn. I'm teaching here at the DEICO program. I actually have more questions now to the speakers, starting from the keynote speaker to Marinka and also to Minna. But I would like to continue the discussion, and I think we are offering different perspectives and also a critical perspective. And I have heard both thoughtful and thought-provoking statements. And as you have seen in the program, I'm presenting on the topic from the global education reform movement to human capital development agenda, educating for proletarianization. I would like to follow up on what Minna has said, and also your point of view about Marinka's point, presenting something on the grassroots, and moving to a more macro kind of perspective. And I would say that there are different tendencies and different interests and different agenda at play in global education and development processes. The issues that you've heard earlier this morning about the keynote lecture, it's basically about classics on dependency. That structure is continuing. And then Marinka and Minna also presented different kind of dynamics and tendencies. And I will also present a global agenda at the moment that is at play. I'm not saying that they are being implemented or whether they will succeed if implemented, but what I'm saying is that there's a single agenda defining international organizations when it comes to global education policy. And that is related to what you have already heard, capitalism and neoliberalism, but they took different forms in different contexts. So here, I would like to start with my contribution to the discussion or forum that we had in the Great Transitions Initiative, where the opening essay was written by Professor Stephen Sterling, who wrote a lot about sustainability education. By sustainability education, he meant either the integration of sustainability in education or looking at education as a change agent towards sustainability. But how do we educate for the future? So where does the process of change come from? There are two things in here, two elements. The first is what we call the ideational and the discursive aspects. So that relates to the epistemic sets of values and ideas. And actually, I would have wanted to ask a question in the keynote this morning, because it seems that much of the discussion really pointed out on the discursive and the ideational, but less so on what Minna has been talking about, the real material conditions existing. And by that, material circumstances, I refer to the socioeconomic, political, and technological pressures. So my main argument in this presentation and what I have written also in this forum is that ideas about global education are not and should not be independent of real material conditions of the contemporary world under capitalism. What I'm agreeing now is that the dependency theory is still in there, but capitalism has evolved already. That there's no single state, not even the United States or the European Union, would be able to influence what the World Bank is thinking, what the OECD is thinking. But there are people in Paris, in the Washington, really writing about the rules of how we should educate pupils and students all over the world. And that is still based on capitalism or neoliberalism. So what we are observing is that there is the process of neoliberalization in global education since the 1980s. The agenda is still to create neoliberal citizens. But we look at it as a process, meaning that it can take different forms, it can have different tendencies, it can move to different directions because there's no end goal. Just like what you heard in the morning, there's no end of history. That's why I would like to look at it as neoliberalization rather than neoliberalism. Yeah, because the process itself has different tendencies. So many of you education majors, and also especially here in Finland, have heard about the work of the alumnus of this university, Professor Pasi Sahlberg, and he introduced the concept called GERM, or the Global Education Reform Movement that started in the 1980s. Basically, it's the tenets of neoliberalism. So just like a germ, neoliberalism is spreading, and it affects education system all over the world. It's characterized by the things you have already heard: competition, privatization, or school choice, standardization, and test-based accountability. And Professor Sahlberg has been arguing that Finland has somehow escaped these features. But I have a different perspective. So it is ongoing. But if you look at the documents of the World Bank now and the OECD, they have a different notion of neoliberalism now. It's not really just about competition. It's more about competitiveness. They are being couched into this, what we call the human capital project or the human capital development agenda, which they launched in 2018. So the focus of the theme is on invest in people. Yeah, the idea is competitiveness, but also to universalize the logic of neoliberalism. So what I'm saying here is that if in the first offensive of neoliberalism, they were saying it's just privatization, what we are actually seeing now is that it doesn't matter whether it's the state or the private sector would invest. So what we are seeing is the World Bank has actually started talking about universal government provisioning of education policy, even public-private partnerships. So even if governments would invest in education, no problem. They would also talk about universal basic education. And the World Bank and the OECD have also introduced the Education Sector Strategy 2020. The agenda is learning for all. So the idea here is that countries, meaning governments, traditionally, they don't want governments to do much about education, but now they say, okay, government should invest early, invest smartly, invest for all youth and children. Because the idea is that by improving their skills, health, knowledge, and resilience, their human capital, people can be more productive, flexible, innovative. So it is not anymore the agenda of the World Bank or the neoliberals to keep poor people stupid and unhealthy. Yeah, the agenda really is for pupils and students to be highly educated, to be highly trained, to be healthy, so that they would be mobile, fluid, flexible, and fully exploitable by capital. That's the idea of competitiveness at the moment. But what we are seeing is that there is this convergence, or what we call policy coordination of education policy now towards what we call on global competitiveness. So the process is leading towards deep marketization through promotion of economic competition and provision of institutional framework and behavioral change. Before, neoliberalism was just concerned about minor issues, focused mostly on the economics, privatization, deregulation, liberalization, fiscal austerity. But now, the agenda of neoliberalism is towards what you call institutional and behavioral change. So if you look at the documents that they are arguing, the World Development Report in 2018, the World Development Report in 2019, they are talking about even using neuroscience and behavioral economics in lifelong learning. The ideas for adult literacy is skills training for wage employment and entrepreneurship programs. So the question now is that whether the UN system, including UNESCO, is also being pressured to converge or to do policy coordination together with the traditional global neoliberal institutions of economic governance, the World Bank, the IMF, and the OECD. I don't have answers to that, but we are seeing that even UNESCO itself is being pressured to adapt to this kind of logic. So now, of course, there are talks about digitalization and the digital economy. So what's the agenda for education in the digital age? So what drives digitalization innovation? It's actually the logic of capitalist competition. And why do you have to focus on competition and competitiveness? The idea is for you to increase labor productivity, increase output, lower the cost of labor, and outcompete your competitors. So, but the kind of globalization we are seeing right now is not only about the globalization of trade and production. It's not only about international financialization. It's not just about constant technological innovations and greater division of labor, but part of the logic and the process is proletarianization, so that laborers would be willing and productive to be exploitable by global capital. There's no problem on that, if you're saying, because it's known, it's normal. Well, the system likes you to be educated, likes you to be skilled, likes you to be healthy. But from the point of view of development, it's problematic. The question is the telos. We agree on our education for all. But what is the goal of education? And for neoliberals, the goal of education is to create a neoliberal citizen. Yeah? So two things: to be a flexible worker, and also, or you can be an entrepreneur. But development studies used to be not like that. Remember in the early 1990s, the UNDP, which we used to look at as more progressive, they were actually criticizing the World Bank. The UNDP took in what we call the human capabilities approach, a humanist critique of World Bank's productivist and economistic kind of approach. Yeah. So that was the so now the question is that are we moving forward global education policy to be productivist, to be just economic agent? And if you look at the government of Finland, first world countries, and even in developing countries, that's just what they would like to see their youth and students at the moment. So because before we look at development we look at education in development as a means for human and social flourishing. But right now, we are all being prepared to be exploitable for the competitive labor market. Oh. And concluding remarks, so I have both analysis and also strategies. And these are the questions that I would have wanted to be asked and answered this morning. In my analysis, I already mentioned to you that the globalization of production, finance, and trade also comes with the process of proletarianization. So the logic of competition does not only concern capitalists, but also governments, states, workers, schools, and students. We all have to embrace the market-oriented education policies to survive the unfolding competitive world market. So this is the real material conditions at play now. It is that logic of competition. Even us in the academia, we are all competitors for so-called scarce resources. But my argument is that while the globalization of the capitalist mode of production is a law of history, the universalization of the capitalist ethos is not a law of nature, because we can propose alternatives, and the colonial thought and all those strategies you've already heard about. But that's just the discursive aspect. And what are my proposed strategies for alternative futures for education and development? 3 things. 1, we really need progressive movements coming from civil society or other activist actors. And I would like here to reintroduce Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. The main goal is really on consciousness raising. So that we, especially youth and students, could take back control of our own lives, because that's what development used to be, and that's what development should be. And then secondly, we need progressive schools and universities. There's a momentum. Even the University of Jyväskylä talks a lot about well-being and wellness as a strategy and wisdom. But schools and universities can also have the nurturing of wisdom as a core mission of education. By wisdom, I mean that the accumulation or acquisition and dissemination of knowledge with ethical and moral considerations. And then lastly, I think we need progressive social and economic policies. And there are many being experimented on, but I have in mind universal and unconditional basic incomes. Why are basic incomes necessary? It's it would resolve problem of unemployment, because the kind of capitalism we have right now, it is creating, when you graduate, you will be in a reserve army of labor. And that's a justification per capital, not to keep you in job, because if you don't want the job, we can hire someone else. It's just like what's happening in the PhD right now. But if you have basic incomes, that you have some buffer and safety nets. But basic income is not only to resolve unemployment. It's also for human resources to have creativity and self-cultivation, and also for the liberation of sentient beings from wage labor. Kiros, thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Bonn. You have spent 2 extra minutes. Was I expected that, but the content was rich and good. And I believe that the audience has a lot of questions now. Starting from the first presenter to the second and third, we can have some things to compare and maybe contrast as well to diverse our knowledge. So the next session is on the discussion. We're going to have more or less a panel discussion, or just a forum discussion where we need to have all the audience engaging. Are you ready? Oh, okay. So from the audience, do we have any Any questions? Oh, no. All right. So I believe that we are going to get some questions from the audience. But for now, the floor is open. For those who have questions or suggestions or opinions. But as we wait for others to get prepared, I have a few questions I would like to ask the presenters. I think the first one will go. Yes. Okay, then that will be good. If I give you the maybe I should give the privilege to the presenters first if they have any questions to ask from each other.
Yeah, maybe the FSDR, or the Finnish Society for Development Research, also just had the policy dialogue about the Finnish development policy today. And I would like to ask Minna the question that was also posed by some of the audience there. Because you were saying that the development actors and humanitarian aid agency, they were surprised when they dealt with Ukraine. And the question in development communities that whether it is appropriate, I don't know whether you define appropriate being moral or ethical or right. Okay, but the question is that is it appropriate for ODA, official development assistance, to be used to aid Ukraine? That was one of the questions during the policy dialogue, and that was not really answered by the MFA representative before. Because Ukraine used to be not really part, development studies, if you say it's focused on the global south. And then traditionally, Ukraine is not, and the Soviet bloc, they are not part of the global south in our vocabulary.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. My question would be why the former Soviet countries would have been excluded from official development aid if they actually have the same statistics which allow them. I mean, the criteria. OECD DAC has certain criteria, for instance, gross national product, etc. And Ukraine fits into those criteria. So what would be the reason not to include Ukraine if it needs support? That would be my question. It is rather, I would say, that in development studies, I mean, maybe a few words. My first education is Russian language and literature. So I'm old enough that I've lived through Soviet Union. Most of you have only heard about Soviet Union, but I've actually been there. And I was surprised when I first went to Moscow, for instance, to see huge colonies of students from developing countries. And nobody ever thought about that. And sort of the whole Soviet Union, because of political reasons, was excluded. And this is also partly because after the Second World War, the UN organizations that we now know dealing with the development questions, they were very much the US originated institutions. And there was Cold War, there has been different, so there has been always political reasons of including, excluding. And Ukraine has been part of, in our world, very much about the Soviet sphere. Now it's struggling of its independence because Russia is not letting go, basically. Russia has its own interpretation of history. Ukraine actually has very different interpretation of history. And now, because of this war, and because of Ukraine politically making very clear that it wants to integrate to the Western world and not to remain in the Soviet world, the Russian world, it is just new for us. Also, I would say, we don't consider Ukraine as aid recipient country because it is white, it is Christian, there is religion there is race. It was never colonized, or not to say never, because it has been colonized by Germany, but not in the same sense than the African countries, for instance, but because it was colonized by the Russian world. So for us, somehow we have excluded it from our development discourses. And that, I would say, is the thing. But if you really look at the OECD DAC criteria, Ukraine fits into that. And it is a recipient country with that criteria.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Anybody? You want to ask?
Thank you. I have a question/comment to make here, directed to Minna. When you were talking about situation in Ukraine, and right now you mentioned few very important points of race, ethnicity, race and religion. And suddenly it came to my mind that and then you also mentioned that Ukraine is having, I'm happy that they're having at least aid, because there are countries like Palestine and then Gaza. You were talking about the destruction of school. Latest report published by UN, Global Perspective and Human Stories, it says that 200 schools have been attacked, and out of those 200 schools, 53 have been completely destroyed. And there is no education at all in Gaza for the past 6 months. And then there is no aid also. So apart from the fact that war is bad for any country, I was constantly thinking that there are a few countries which can't even have the aid. And we all know that Finland recently declined, that they don't have enough resources to take any injured patients from Gaza. So, there are deeper levels of decision makings that we see. And then this divide between haves and have-nots. So there's also, you might agree with me, that there's a selective perception when it comes to aid and actually being there for each other as countries. So I wanted to have your opinion, as you have a lot of experience with it.
Yes, I do agree. I mean, we have to understand that development aid has always been political project. And we can see that, unfortunately, if we compare the aid flows to Ukraine and aid flows to Gaza, for instance. Politics is there, and we can't get rid of that. We also, all of you who live here understand that Finnish development policy has also changed during this current government. And we have to be realistic. It is not that we aid and we support whoever needs the support. It is a selective process, which takes into consideration many factors. And unfortunately, in this case, those factors are not on the side of Gaza. We know that there is a lot of destruction, a lot of need. But for some reason, the international community is not rushing to Gaza the way that it has been rushing to Ukraine. So this is good for Ukraine, of course, but we have also heard a lot of criticism from, for instance, African countries who have said that, for instance, if you look at the refugee crisis, like millions of Ukrainians left the country very quickly, and Europe was welcoming them. What happened when refugees from Syria flooded into Europe? We started to talk about shutting the borders. And now Europe is actually talking about how to ensure that the others, are kept outside. There's nothing that we can be proud of in this kind of the policy. But I think that we have to understand that also development aid is about policy and politics. It has been good for Ukraine in that sense. And I think that I'm not the only one who understands that the fact of their ethnicity, the fact of their religion, but also the fact that Ukraine is in heart of Europe has a lot to do with the fact that it gets a lot of support. Does it get enough support? Does it get enough the type of the support that it needs? It's of course a different question. But this war in Ukraine has changed, for instance, our whole foreign policy. Finland has joined NATO. A decade ago, we couldn't have imagined the situation that we would be like the Finns would like to become part of the NATO. So this has been tremendous historical, some kind of the point. We don't know yet what is the outcome, but we can say already that many countries have been impacted one way or another because of this war. For us, for many, unfortunately, Gaza and Israel, it's something distant. And that also has to do with people's willingness and political parties' willingness to join our forces and to support.
Thank you so much for Verna's explanation. Okay. Then after you, I'll shoot my question.
My question is to Marinka. I was wondering, I would like to get some insight on the selection of your case studies for your project. I mean, Ecuador, Kenya, and Finland. I'm curious, do these three countries or communities, what they have in common that is of particular interest in your project? Is it a comparative study between those, and what kind of things you're looking to investigate? And also, just out of curiosity, how have there been any challenges in approaching these communities, like in the field work? How is that done? I know it's a very culturally sensitive project, but I'm wondering, like, how is that first contact done? Is it with community leaders? Does it have to be communicated to the governments or anything like that? Because, yeah, it's what I want to do also. So.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I'm not the best person to reply because Tuija is our project leader, has been working in Ecuador. Why we have the three countries, I think we wanted, well, first of all, those are the countries where we have worked. So it's really practical reason why we selected those countries. And also, I think we wanted to get different perspectives, like the Ecuadorian link is Johanna and Tuija, who are in the project, and Natalie, she's from Ecuador. They have done work there for, there was an academy project run by Paula Minoya, and they were part of this project, and she had contacts to the universities in Ecuador. They had contacts to some activist groups in the Amazon, and Tuija and Johanna have been, together with Natalie, they have been contacting those people there. And yeah, the process is through project, the community leaders, and so they already have established the relationship, and it takes time to build the trust and to really collaborate. And I don't have any other anecdotes that I could share because I was not there myself, but what I have heard from them is that, yeah, it has taken years of time, actually. But they have good relationships. Tuija was there doing her PhD for many years, and yes, so it's quite well established, the link there. And as for Kenya, then of course Rose is from a local university there, and she has her connections and to the communities there. And myself and Johanna, we worked in the Taita Hills. There's actually a research station by the University of Helsinki. Lots of research has been going on there in natural sciences and agricultural sciences, also by Kenyans and Finnish. There's this partnership or a cooperation there, but not much on education. So I plan to do some, when I get to work with the schools, then I plan to get their perspective on sustainability, on youth, maybe this kind of learning that Bonn was talking about, the consciousness raising. Yeah, because I think that's also a central theme in my PhD, the Freirean concept of co-developing, co-working together, and not just coming there to, we know what you should do. And yeah, so I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you so much. Okay, I have two questions. One I'll direct it to Bonnie and another to Minna. So you have talked a lot about neoliberalization of the global education. And when you're explaining, I'd note you're talking about inequalities from this. It's like this kind of education policy or global policy is treating everybody equally. Do you see any kind of the ways this kind of neoliberalization of global policy creating inequalities in different contexts? That is the question for you. And a question to Minna. When you're presenting, I was so keen to know how the coordination of aid is done at the national level. And you talked about the issue of having the sector working groups, of which I know even in my country we have that one. And one of the challenges that we have been experiencing is having weak sector working groups, of which do not have power. Sometimes you find the donors are more powerful, like they come with their own priorities. So, but for the case of Ukraine, you said that the government is very strong. It has strong ministry. And my thinking was that, okay, if the government is very strong, then even the sector working groups will be strong. They'll be more influential. But then you said that they are not working well. And I wanted to know why, because I think something that I need to learn. I've been like doing some consultants in my country, in Tanzania. I've seen that as a problem, and I would like to know from your case. That's it.
Yeah, global inequalities are obvious. What I'm saying is that if you look at the agenda of the old neoliberal global governance institutions, they are not anymore being instrumentalized by traditionally the Washington institutions. Yeah. So the agenda now is for them to have a sense of relative autonomy from particular states. And that means that even the United States will have to compete with Kenya, with Tanzania, with China. So the agenda now is to create a global competition centers that you compete with one another. That's the logic of global competitiveness. They even problematize inequality. Yeah, the World Economic Forum problematized inequality. Why is that so? Because inequality is bad for growth. But they still have this agenda about growth obsession and productivity obsession. Climate change, they also problematize climate change because climate change is also not good for growth and the economy. Yeah. So my point here is that, well, there is this reality of uneven development. But then if you look at the agenda of these institutions, they are not anymore being instrumentalized by the old global north, the way we see it in dependency theory. I'm just saying that there's that agenda and that there's that framework. I'm not arguing whether they would succeed or not and how they will be implemented in different contexts. And that's for our own empirical studies. But just based on my own research methodology, just looking at the series of world development reports and the economic outlook of these global governance institutions, you will see that they really have a different discourse now. Yeah, that's why from what we heard this morning, that needs updating because I'm saying that there are different logics, different interests at play. I'm just not denying the fact of global inequalities. I think what we should be clear about is the telos. Yeah, meaning what's the end goal? Because we can always have progressive terminologies and vocabularies, but what's the end goal? We would like to have universal basic education. We would even like to have free education. Everybody likes also universal healthcare. World Bank also talks about those things now. But what's their goal? For you to be healthy and highly educated and then ready for exploitation for global capital. To be just a proletariat or an entrepreneur. And that's problematic because in the university and education, we used to teach our pupils and students to be educated so that you can have total human liberation or you have human flourishing or social flourishing. But that's not the global agenda of the education policymakers at the moment.
My question would be that cannot these two exist at the same time? That you can still be happy and do what you want, and then somebody can exploit yourself or pay your salary. I think that's we can also look at this from a slightly different perspective. But going to the question, I would like to start from a little bit different perspective. You know that Finland has been formally selected as the happiest country of the world several times in a row, and there are two versions that you can say about this. First is that a Finn asks, "Oh bloody hell, am I the only one who is unhappy?" And the other one is that how miserable other nations are. And similarly, this somehow, in my mind, links to the sector working group. Sector working group on education and science has been several times in the donor community and said that it's one of the best. It is an example. I have been working with that sector working group very closely, and my mind thought, okay, if we are the best, how the others are doing, because it depends what you look at. It is true that government of Ukraine is strong, and that is positive thing, because they are not the ones with whom, for instance, the World Bank would say that you have to do this. They already had started education reforms before the war, before the COVID. They already had a direction of how to develop the education. And by the way, Finland was one of their key models, Finnish education. I'm not sure if that is a good model anymore, but still, I mean, we also have problems in our education. I think that the only way to develop constantly is to understand that you have to develop constantly. You can never stop and say, now we are the best, full stop. But anyway, in the sector working group, the challenges are that the Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine, they basically convey the messages of what are their needs. But there has been very little space to actually collaboratively discuss the strategic priorities, for instance. So their policy has rather been that everything is a priority. Every single level of education is priority. That is even in their strategy. And then when you have limited resources, if you prioritize everything, you basically don't prioritize anything, right? So you have to still be able to make choices. And these critical choices have not been discussed collectively in the sector working groups. And that I would say is something that should be developed. The positive thing is that out of these 28 sector working groups that were established in 2020, only a few actually were operational and working. And sector working group on education and science was one of them, which has been working all through the COVID and then the war. actually war intensified the regularity of the meetings because there is more needs coming all the time. And the government understood that this is actually the way that they can convey the needs to the collective donor community at the same time. But as I also mentioned, there were no sort of indicators that we could monitor. So there is limitations of what it could be what it could do. So how we tried to sort of go around that challenge was that we have had donors informal meetings, so without the government. So this has been a platform for us to discuss what are you going to do, what is Germany going to do, what is Finland going to do. I even created a house space for us to communicate among ourselves because there was very little space in the meetings as such. So yeah, there are challenges. So strong government doesn't necessarily make the sector working group working well.
Thank you so much. I think we are running out of time. We have already spent 4 minutes extra. I believe we do not have any more questions. Okay, just one.
It's more of something to think over coffee. I think one thing that hasn't been discussed, at least in this session, is the very formidable challenge to neoliberal globalization that has emerged in the West. And that, of course, is the populist right-wing progress that we have both in the United States, of course, which I've been thinking about a lot since last week, but also a very strong realignment politically in Europe, in Finland, in Sweden, in Germany, in France, in Italy. How is that going to change that very formidable challenge to the neoliberal project? How is that going to change the impact that has on education policy globally? I only have bad ideas of what that could be, but that's a very interesting question, I think, and that will challenge the paradigm of critical studies into neoliberal capitalism, I think. It should, because there is a formidable political force that has challenged it, and it's won a lot of elections.
Thank you. I think that is directed. Bonnie, I'll also add one there. When you look at having Trump coming back to power, I think also connects well with his question. How do you see the influence on the global education policy?
Yeah, watch out for this Project 2025 that Trump and Musk are denying. So this Project 2025 is a deeply conservative project, but they pretend to be liberal. If you look at Trump and Musk talking about presenting themselves as libertarians, that universities are into censorship. Actually, my students here would say that we've been talking a lot about Trump and Musk in my courses. We are not censoring them. But I'm saying that this protectionist agenda of Trump, this is also based on the logic of competition that even themselves are being threatened. Protectionism is a strategy against competition. So what I'm arguing here is that the logic of competition now, the politics of global competitiveness, it's all over the world. Yeah, that even the US themselves are also subjected to that kind of logic. And that's why we should not only look at in terms of the level of the nation state, but I think it's necessary to go back to the class perspective, not just identity, but the classic class identity, which is capital versus labor, and who's exploiting the identity of the working class? It's the right-wing populist. Yeah, Donald Trump and many other right-wing people have presented themselves as advocates, defenders of the working class. So what our agenda is to reclaim that kind of discourse The Democrats have lost that that kind of agenda, and it's also because of the so-called liberal identity politics that also universities have been accomplice to that, and by denying, that identity that unites many of all of us, and it has been proven in many elections. Trump recently, it's the identity of the working class because that's what unites many of us. Yeah, if not the overwhelming majority of us, yeah. So it's the class-based identity that we should not forget. It's still key as a mobilizing force in terms of discourse and also politically. Unfortunately, we lost it to these guys at the moment.
Maybe I would just add here that if we look at this populism and what is happening, it seems to me that the world which has been very much about economic driven kind of the agenda, the people who for any reason have not found their own place in this kind of the world order and this kind of the economic logic now have turned to populist politicians, which basically in very many places claim that the problems that we are facing are because of the immigrants. And this is something which unites very often these populist politics, that because when you yourself cannot do it here, it's much easier to look at the other and say that it is because they take my work, rather than looking at, have I done what I should have done myself? And I think we are turning inwards as societies, unfortunately. And I think that this is something that each and every one of us have to somehow try to turn around. This is not the future that we want. At least this is not the future that I want. And I don't want this kind of the future, for instance, for my children. We have to understand that this can turn into radical business.
I think we're really out of time, but I'm just going to say that if some of you are going to be teachers or work with youth or children, I think critical thinking and raising this consciousness that Bonn was talking about, and this transformative learning, I think, is something that individuals, I mean, teachers in Finland have a lot of power, actually. I mean, we have a curriculum, but then there is a potential that you can read, you can teach critical thinking. So I think if you're wondering, like, so you should teach critical thinking. And I think as long as we're talking about this, there's still hope in university. If we are conscious of these forces around us, then we can be those critical voices and those progressive voices. So let's end on the note of hope.
And that makes the end of our session. Can you please give a round of applause to our speakers and to ourselves as well for being attentive and interactive. Yes, thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Hopefully you'll also attend tomorrow's sessions as well.